A young girl gets told that her prince would arrive one day under the Scarlet Sails and will take her away and make her happy. Sounds like a plot to a Disney movie now, doesn't it? Well, kinda. Let's talk. Alexander Grin is often labelled as the author of a single successful book, Scarlet Sails in his case, which is not strictly fair. He's written over 400 pieces, it's simply just that the Scarlet Sails has resonated with the audiences most. Another misconception about him, or legend, or rumour, is that he'd once stolen a suitcase of stories from a ship captain and was translating them and publishing them under his own name. Also not true, but one can understand where such an idea might come from. Grin's prose is unlike anything you will see in Russian literature, and not simply because he gives his characters foreign names, but we will get to it in a second. Let me tell you about him first, because his life was quite a roller coaster. Alexander Grinevsky was born 1880 in Vyatka. Family life wasn't particularly great. He didn't get along with his stepmother, and his father didn't pay too much attention to his son. Alexander was sent to the roughest school in town, where his behavioral issues only grew, and eventually he was expelled from there. He did love to read, though. One of his favorite books was Gulliver's Travels, and he did dream of travels of his own. At 16 years old, Grin ran away from home to fulfill his dream of sea and travel. He got accepted as a cabin boy on a ship that was heading to Egypt. Grin was not cut out for the hard labor and life on a ship, though. He was suffering from seasickness and all, so this trip was the only one that Grin ever took abroad. So he didn't get to be a seaman. What next then? He tried all sorts of professions: fisherman, woodcutter, gold digger, miner, until one day he landed with the wrong crowd and was arrested for attempting to sell stolen goods. He wasn't convicted, but his father was sick and tired of his son's behavior and sent him to the army. After 6 months in reserve infantry battalion, of which 3 Grin spent in a cell, he deserted, got caught, brought back, and then ran away again. This is where he got picked up by the socialist revolutionaries. Socialist revolutionaries of the 1900s were, for all intents and purposes, terrorists. They had 2 jobs, basically: propaganda and recruitment, and terrorist acts. Grin was first recruited to perform the terrorist acts, but he refused at the last minute and got switched to propaganda since the higher-ups in the groups noticed his way with words. He got arrested in Sevastopol in 1903. The investigation lasted over a year, during which he made 2 attempts for the prison break, just like in the movies, one while trying to climb out of the window using tied-together linens, and the other one while digging a tunnel. He got sentenced to 10 years, but only served 2, and was released 1905 with Nikolai II's amnesty. It's hard to tell really if Grin actually believed in the ideas of the socialist revolutionaries or the methods that they've chosen, since his joining of the group is also tied to a woman, Ekaterina Bibergal. Bibergal was highly invested in the revolution, and Grin was highly invested in her. It looks like they had an affair, but Bibergal was much more interested in the underground activities of their group, and Grin was becoming more and more jealous. They reconnected after his stint in prison. They met in St. Petersburg in 1906, where they had a huge row and an official breakup, where in a fit of rage, Grin shot her. Thankfully, the bullet passed through without touching any major organs, and Katya even covered for him afterwards, so Grin got away from this particular incident scot-free. Grin still got arrested that same year, 1906, and that's how he actually met his first wife, Vera Abramova, who was the so-called prisoner's bride. Compassionate young women used to visit the prisoners who had no relatives or friends close by, and Vera was one of them. According to legend, during one of the visits, Grin grabbed and kissed her, and that was her first kiss, so it left a lasting impression. But Vera, with her kind heart and compassionate nature, is the prototype for many female characters for Grin. Grin was exiled to Tobolsk, but he ran away to Vyatka within 3 days of arriving there, where his father got him a fake passport that allowed him to return to St. Petersburg. And this is where Grin's literary journey finally began. That same year, 1906, he published his first stories under the pseudonym Alexander Grin. He published story after story, series of them even, over the next few years, and he also integrated himself somewhat into the literary circles of that time. He met authors like Andreev, Bryusov, and Kuprin. 1910, Grin got arrested again for that fake passport that he had and got sent off to Arkhangelsk, where he and his wife Vera lived for 2 years until they returned to St. Petersburg in 1912, where Grin returned to his previous life of writing, drinking, parties, and women. Grin got paid quite nicely for his stories, but he was not simply irresponsible with his money. He was an alcoholic, so every wage that he got spent pretty quickly on parties, booze, and women. That's why his wife Vera left him in 1913, citing Grin's uncontrollability and unpredictability, and his constant benders, and just general mutual misunderstanding. And by all accounts, this was perfectly fair and true. Grin was uncontrollable by himself or others, really. He would disappear for days and then suddenly reappear again and spend all of his money on booze once again, so not a pretty life. There is a story from later in his life. He was supposed to appear in court one morning because he was suing one of the publishers for quite a bit of money, so it was quite crucial for him to be there that morning and sober. And yet still, on the way to the courthouse, he stopped by every single pub on the way there, so by the time that he arrived in court, he couldn't string a single sentence together. His alcoholism was no joke. In 1914, Grin was even briefly admitted in a mental institution, but he ran away from there as well. But that's when World War I happened, and more importantly, the October Revolution. Grin's stories pivoted to condemning the cruelty and riots that accompanied the revolution, and he got arrested again for the 4th time in 1918. That same year, he also briefly married his second wife, Maria, but they only stayed married for about 6 months. Grin then got drafted into the Red Army, but was soon released from there due to his sickness. He got typhus there, and so he returned to St. Petersburg. Thanks to Maxim Gorky, Grin got a spot in a house of arts that Gorky had founded, where such authors like Gumilev, Mandelstam, and Rождественский lived. This city post-revolution was close to starving, so it was quite a nice opportunity. During his time in the house, he'd written quite a few pieces, including The Scarlet Sails. 1921, Grin met his third and last wife, Nina Mironova. Their first encounter is retold in his story Ratcatcher. During those first few years of the Soviet Union, Grin had problems with publishing his stories, but with the new economic policy and especially independent publishers, the money returned, but so did Grin's spending habits. Nina was so worried about her husband that she even made a deal with a doctor who told them that Nina was quite sick and needed fresh air and warmer climates, so the couple moved to Crimea. The unspoken deal between the spouses was that he wouldn't drink in Crimea, but when he went to St. Petersburg for work, his benders were extra rough. The early 1920s were incredibly productive for him, though. His novels The Shining World, The Golden Chain, She Who Runs on Waves all stem from this time. Unfortunately, Grin was coined as anti-Soviet then because of his novel The Road to Nowhere, which strictly speaking had nothing anti-Soviet in it, but simply the title did it. And so during the late 1920s and early 1930s, there was almost a ban on publishing anything by him, so the money ran out. The spouses gradually sold everything they had until they were at the point of starvation. Grin was also sick. Nina sold a golden bracelet, a gift from Grin, in 1932. She bought a small house in Stary Krym, where Grin passed away in June 1932 from stomach cancer. Grin was not published and almost forgotten until 1960s, when a lot of writers returned to the shelves, and Grin was one of them. Scarlet Sails was a standout amongst all of his writing and remains a staple to this day. And now, having said all that, what if I told you that this man has written the most hopeful fairy tale-like stories in Russian lit? The thing about Grin is that his stories are quite unique in their tone and execution. Some call them mystical stories, fantasy, fairy tales, or some call them neo-romanticism. Grin himself felt closest to the symbolism, although he was never part of the symbolist movement of the Silver Age. The best way I can describe his prose is like Alexander Dumas crossed with Neil Gaiman, or Terry Pratchett if Neil Gaiman has been cancelled already. Most of Grin's stories are set in an imaginary land that was later called Grinlandia by the critics. The Shining World, the Golden Chain, She Who Runs on Waves, Scarlet Sails, Fandango, they are all set in this universe. It is a country that Grin had mapped out fully in his head. The locations appear in different stories, although it's not a connected universe, so to speak, in a way that we understand it now. This land of Grin's, it exists in our world. There are references to actual real locations, but it also exists according to its own laws and rules. There are elements of supernatural and mystical in it. For Grin, his writing and his stories were a source of escape from reality. You can see it sometimes in the most innocuous details, like how many stories feature ships and sea, a lost dream of Grin's. Grin also hated anything and everything to do with the technological progress. He once visited an air show and was completely disgusted by the new planes, because in his mind, a man should strive to fly without any planes. You can see this experience reflected in The Shining World, where the protagonist does learn to fly. In the same vein, due to the sphere of technology, all of the travel by sea is done on sailboats. And by the looks of it, technology is somewhat replaced by the mystical elements. Grin's stories in no way like Harry Potter or even Lord of the Rings, but Grin sprinkles in these bits and bobs that fit his world and his reality quite nicely. Like, for example, the spirit of a woman who saves the protagonist in She Who Runs on Waves. The line between real and surreal blends in Grin's stories, and the characters accept the surreal as normal. Grin is mostly associated with his light and hopeful pieces, but he also has some darker and downright scary stories. Ratcatcher is creepy and scary in a way that a child's nightmare is scary, while the Grey Automobile is downright horror in Edgar Allan Poe's sense. Grin actually really liked Poe. You can see that influence in some of his darker pieces. But let's talk Scarlet Sails. It was hard to imagine that such a bright flower, warmed by the love for people, could have been born here, in the gloomy, cold, and half-starved Petrograd, in the winter twilight of the harsh 1920, that it was grown by a man outwardly gloomy, unfriendly, and it seemed engrossed in a very special world, a world that he did not want to let anybody in. The first notes about the story can be found in the drafts to She Who Runs on Waves as early as 1917, but the story was finally finished in 1922. Because the story came out right after the Red Revolution, the Soviet reading of the story was that the sails represent this dawn of communism, which is like, no. It was influenced by the revolution in a sense that it pushed Grin further into literature as escapism, but I don't think that the story itself has anything to do with the commies. Let's recap the plot of the book real quick, and then we will talk what this book actually is. A sailor called Grin returns from a long voyage to find out that his wife had passed away, leaving an infant daughter. The neighbor who's been taking care of the child tells him how his wife went to the village begging for help, and the barkeep only offered her help in return for love. Grin stays home to raise his daughter Assol. He doesn't like the people of the village that much, and they don't like him, which only gets worse when the aforementioned barkeep gets washed away during the storm and Grin refuses to help and save him. Grin and Assol are thus outcasts. Assol grows up with her dad, the kids don't want to play with her, nobody really talks to them. One day she takes the toys that Grin makes to the village, And on the way there, she decides to play with a ship with red sails. She puts it on water, but it gets away from her. She chases after it, and the ship gets caught by a traveling storyteller. He decides to humor the girl and tells her that her prince would arrive one day on a ship under scarlet sails and will take her away. Young Assol is very excited by the story, but the villagers catch wind of the story and tease her for it mercilessly. Years go by. In a different corner of the world, a boy called Arthur Grey grows up in a castle. He's adventurous and strong-minded. One day in a library, he sees a picture of a ship and decides that he wants to be a sea captain. He runs away from home one day and finds his way onto a ship. He works his way from cabin boy to a sailor and then gets noticed by the captain, who teaches him everything that he needs to know. Grey uses his part of the inheritance to buy himself a ship and becomes a captain. One day, he's standing in port and decides to go fishing on shore, where he finds a sleeping Assol. Assol, now a young woman, was taking a walk on a beach and has fallen asleep right after sunrise. Grey decides that she's going to be his wife, puts a ring on her finger, and goes to the village to find out more about her. There he learns the stories told about Assol and her father, and specifically the one about the Scarlet Sails, and he decides to make her dream come true. Assol wakes up on the beach with a ring on her finger, and she instinctively knows that her life is about to change. The next morning, she looks up to the horizon, sees the scarlet sails. She runs through the village to the ship, right into the waiting arms of Grey. They get married and sail away into the sunset. It does feel like a fairy tale now, doesn't it? It is true, it's a very archetypical story, but it is also a very green story. But let's look at the archetypes first. The story has the same feel, flavor, and plot as those early Disney movies, where a young girl with a good heart gets mistreated by people around her, and then she marries a prince whom she had only met the day before. And there has been a lot of criticism directed at these stories, specifically about what message are we really teaching young girls. There is a good message in there somewhere about being a good person. Both Cinderella and Snow White are characterized as such. Despite what their evil stepmothers throw at them, they remain nice, kind-hearted, and hopeful.
I forgive you.
But there are obviously problems with this narrative on the very base level about how all of the women's problems can be solved by a man. It is more nuanced than that, but you get the idea. And as you can see, that this structure is very much present in the Scarlet Sails. A young girl outcast by the town meets a sorcerer who predicts that she's going to marry a prince. And she does, without saying a single word to him. How nice for them. Don't do that. But let's turn off the cynical part of our brains for a second and take a look at who these characters actually are. By and large, Grin is interested in a person, and only a person outside of his connection with history, nationality, wealth or poverty, religion and political beliefs. Grin sort of abstracts, cleanses his characters from these layers, and sterilizes his world, because this way the person is better visible to him. Both Assol and Grey are quite typical protagonists for Grin. Grin had a certain idea of what a good person is, and we can see it in both of them in Scarlet Sails. And that thing is that they are both dreamers. This type of character is generally more typical for our female protagonists, we need to acknowledge it, and Assol fits the mold quite nicely. She does not belong to this world, she exists somewhere else, or at least on the border between these two worlds. She has the power to see beyond the mundane, and she has faith in her future. Assol, just like those Disney princesses, is a little bit more passive than her male counterpart, yes, but I feel like it fits her character, background and station. She grew up alone, shunned from day one, only her imagination and Lundgren's toys to keep her company. She's not a victim in a full sense, although it is mentioned that the treatment of the town hurts her quite a bit, but realistically she cannot change that. She doesn't even have a Gaston to offer her a treadwife life. No, she's left to her dreams. The villagers do not understand her or her dreams, and thus they fear her. They call her odd, crazy, to further push away the other. Gray's story plays out differently. He's more active, but that's because he ends up in a position of power thanks to his heritage and background, sprinkled with some dedication and hard work. He plays out Grin's old dream of becoming a sea captain, something that Grin never got. Gray goes through the same hardships that Grin did, but he overcomes them, gets noticed by the captain, and gets rewarded for it, something that never happened to Grin. But also, Gray is just as big of a dreamer as Assol is. He chooses her because seemingly he senses a kindred spirit, but he also gets to take a more active role here. Having committed himself to this girl that he leered at the beach, he goes off to learn more about her, and once he understands what she actually dreams of, he decides to make her dream come true. Quick sidebar, if we look at the love story, the memorable imagery is that of Assol looking at the Scarlet Sails that appear from the horizon, and thus the story becomes about her faith and her dream, when for me it's more about Gray and his desire to make her happy. If we remove the circumstances of them not knowing one another and just look at what he did, it's an amazing thing. He makes a choice to go out of his way, spend a lot of money and resources to make the dream come true for the woman he loves. And I think that's powerful. And really, extravagant gifts are not my love language, but simply this willingness and desire to do such a thing for your beloved is hella attractive, don't you agree? Because really, the Scarlet Sails themselves are a metaphor, so it's really about knowing what your beloved really cares about and wishes for, and being willing and happy to make it happen for them. And I think it's beautiful. Ironically, this story might be the most grounded out of all of Grin's stories. All of the mystical and magical elements here are done by people. The very prophecy that kicks it all off is not a prophecy at all, but a fancy of a drunk storyteller. So in principle, this story might be teaching us that we can make magic happen and miracles happen by ourselves, just like Gray did. But coming back to Gray, he's not that different from Assol in a sense that he's just as misunderstood or not understood at all by the people around him. His actions are just accepted as captain's quirks, while Assol is shunned for the same type of behavior. When Gray decides to fashion the Scarlet Sails and finally tells his first mate about the plan, the first mate does not fully believe him and plays along, rationalizing his captain's behavior as him covering up for smuggling goods because that makes more sense to him. So Gray is just as alone as Assol is, he just simply has more power and resources, so it doesn't bother him as much. And so one could argue that the love story is not that important to the messaging of the story. Because the messaging of the story could be them versus the rest of the world. Grin's universe in general does not work according to our morals and standards. Grin makes no secret in what he values in his characters. It's their hopefulness, their ability to dream like a child. For them, nothing is impossible if they simply believe in it. And those are the types of characters that get rewarded. We see it in the Scarlet Sails in Assol and her father being juxtaposed to the small provincial town, or a village really, and how Assol is then rewarded for her virtue. Only when Assol and Gray find one another, because they are kindred spirits, they can be happy together. There is also added bonus of villagers being literally stunned and afraid at seeing proof that Assol's dream can and does come true. Similarly, an even more obvious example of the same conflict is present in Grin's novel She Who Runs on Waves, where the protagonist has a choice between the two women, and the deciding factor between them is whether or not they believe the mystical story that he tells them. And so, only characters like Gray and Assol are worthy of eternal happiness. There is a slight issue here, though, and it has to do with the allusions to the Bible. I need like a custom graphic or a sound effect for biblical allusions at this point. I'm no expert, but from my research, biblical allusions can be found in texts, like the picture of Jesus that Gray fixes as a child. Then there are allusions, like Gray going fishing, and apparently fishing is very important in the Bible. It has something to do with the apostles, I don't know. According to the lecture that I listened to, there are quite a few biblical allusions and references, so feel free to look for them in the text. And then there is the very ending and the metaphor behind the Scarlet Sails, and them going away into another world, i.e. paradise. All of the imagery speaks to it. There is also the wine that they drink on the ship that had the caveat, Gray will only drink this wine in paradise. So it's all there. Grin was religious, so it's not that far-fetched to read the story as them going to heaven. It's just that I do not like this reading. And not simply because I'm not religious myself, but because, well, as Sol and Gray get this offer of salvation, the villagers have no hope. As the Secret proceeded at full speed under full sail away from Caperna, which had been struck dumb forever, the justing around the cask was greater than anything in this matter that occurs at great fete. And it's all fine and dandy for the villains to get their comeuppance, but not when you're dealing with religious illusions, when in reality their sin was simply conformity and normalcy, while the protagonists are exceptional just by the virtue of who they are. Writer Andrei Platonov was thinking in the same vein in his article on the Scarlet Sails. Having gone by ship to the open sea of their mutual double loneliness, Gray and Assol, in fact, do not reveal to us the secret to human happiness. The author leaves it beyond the horizon of the ocean, where the lovers departed, and the story ends there. In fact, Gray and Assol could have found their happiness only in some specific relation to the people of the village of Caperna, but they did otherwise. They left the people alone on the shore. If Gray, and especially Assol, represent, as author wanted them to, valuable human characters, then their actions are vicious. According to Grin's plan, Assol and Gray are people of special, better quality. They have a higher, passionate, poetic power, almost non-existent to the other people. But what does this power of theirs matter for reality? I'll leave it up to you to decide where you stand on this question, though. The other motif that I want to mention here is the sun motif. Those allusions to heaven and them sailing off towards the sun is one thing, but also the Scarlet Sails are also the sun. Assol first sees the Scarlet Sails as a vision during the sunrise. Then the ring that Gray puts on her finger is compared to the sun. Gray holds the sun in his hands a few times throughout the book, and arguably, Assol herself could be the sun. Sol, in some of the Latin languages, is sun, so Assol could be towards the sun. I will leave it up to you to decide what this motif means, though, because I do not know. The thing that I struggle with the most when it comes to these videos, but the one that I engage with most, is the language. Somehow, every single time, I feel like I fail to convey what I like and enjoy about a particular author's style. And it's not simply because you, my dear viewer, and I are reading different texts, which is also true. At times I select a quote to represent the point that I'm making here. I go to the translation to look it up and find out that it doesn't work as well in the English translation, and I often move on without including it. But some of it is my own failing. I do have a linguistics degree, even though I've forgotten most of the things that we were taught in lexicology and stylistics. But I also think that these 30-minute videos are not about such deep dives either. But at times I want to share what I felt when I read a certain type of story, what feeling it evoked in me, or when I notice when a writer does something interesting with style or words. Look at this passage of Assol trying to chase down the toy ship, or this one about Assol as well. There is something magical in there that I love that I cannot express with words. Remember that symbolist influence for Grin that I've mentioned earlier in the video. Grin tries to push the boundaries of what he can do with his story by using metaphors, allegories, and paradoxes. Grin comes close to romanticism in a sense that his stories are a heightened version of reality, where goodness, truth, and love rule over everything. And maybe, just like for Grin, this story, like a good fairy tale, can be a source of an escape from reality. Maybe the lessons that Grin tries to teach us here are not readily applicable to the reality you and I live in, but maybe, just maybe, we should strive for it. Did you notice it in the background? Hope you did.